Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the webinar of Pluralism and Conflict Studies. I hope you are all well, staying safe and healthy. I'm Kazemzadeh from Ottawa, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you as the moderator to the monthly seminar on theoretical and practical aspects of peace building and conflict prevention at the St. Paul University. Thank you for showing up on this bright afternoon in Ottawa, at least in Ottawa and Ontario. Before we begin this webinar with our honorable guest, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to all of you who sincerely committed to this event to make it a success. First, we are very grateful to the Rector of University, Professor Chatel Bouvet, for the tremendous support that Her Excellency provided as the host, and also to the monthly seminar organizing committee, St. Paul University Student Association, SPUSA, and Academic Club for Peace and Conflict Studies. I see most of them attended today. Abigail, Beyonce, Amuja, Holly, thanks to all of you. Secondly, we would like to express our appreciation to the Global Center for Pluralism, especially Mrs. McGhie, to accept our team's invitation, and Mrs. Kalina Elven to help us for communication. Well, let me move on to today's topic. As all of you know, the academic field of conflict studies is relatively young, although the practice of conflict resolution is as old as mankind. Integration knowledge from multiple disciplines, conflict studies have formed by broad foundation of interdisciplinary theory, research, and practice. And from time to time, I think, and a lot of researchers think, we need to update theoretical and practical concepts in this field. By the way, we have pluralism as a theoretical concept, which is a normative response to the presence of human differences, can reinforce the field of conflict studies in theory, and on the other hand, can improve conflict resolution in practice. Today, this is our privilege that we have Mrs. McGhie, who has wealth expertise on this topic and can share her thoughts and inspire pathways to advance pluralism in peace and conflict studies with us. Please let me introduce you and to welcome Her Excellency Meredith Preston McGhie, current Secretary General at Global Center for Pluralism in Ottawa. Mrs. McGhie has devoted more than 20 years to addressing conflict and instability in Africa and Asia in some of the most troubled situations. From working with Naga in Southeast India, an indigenous community on the Thai-Myanmar border, to supporting UN efforts in Kosovo, northern Iraq, and several African countries, her work has promoted frontline negotiation, mediation, policy, and peace diplomacy. Most recently as Africa Regional Director with the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, she oversaw this HD Center's complex mediation and peace dialogue efforts in Nigeria, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Sudan, Somalia, and South Sudan, among other places. Moreover, she has contributed annually to the Oslo Forum and teaches mediation practice internationally. Mrs. Preston McGhie studied military and international history at the University of British Columbia and graduate studies in global security at Keele University in the UK. Well, it's time to learn more about how pluralism can be used for conflict studies and peace building. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mrs. McGhie. Ma'am, floor is yours. Very welcome.
I am muted. I am now unmuted. There we go. Listen, thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm really, really pleased to be with you, and again, really grateful for your interest, not just obviously in peacemaking and conflict resolution, but also in pluralism itself. As Hamid has introduced me, I've spent the bulk of my professional life outside of Canada, the last 2 decades or more, focusing specifically on mediation and supporting peace processes, primarily in Africa, a bit in the Middle East, and a bit in Asia. Just before I dive in, I did want to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. In all of these discussions, especially around peacemaking, I think it's particularly important to acknowledge that we are on unceded territory. We are on territory that has not benefited from any kind of agreement or peace treaty that gives us the right to be on the Algonquin land. I think it's also a really important reminder that all of us, as we work on peacemaking and studying peace processes around the world, that we also have a really important role as peacemakers here in Canada. I kind of wanted to discuss, couch my discussion in sort of 3 sections today. Hamid, you sort of mentioned sort of 20 to 25 minutes. I'm going to try not to talk over long because I'm really, really keen to hear questions from people and have a bit of a discussion. So really happy to expand on any areas, and particularly really happy to expand on any particular conflict settings or processes that I've been involved in, but I was really going to focus really on sort of 3 parts. First is a reflection on the field of peacemaking and sort of where we stand right now. The second would be really delving into the role of pluralism and how it can contribute in peacemaking. And the third is a little bit of a couple of thoughts on where we go as students of the field, of academics and as practitioners. If at any point, Hamid, I start to cut out, please just yell and I will turn off my camera. My internet has been a bit unstable since I've been sharing the house with my children online schooling for the last while. So to sort of dive into really thinking about where the field is at the moment, when I left Canada in the late 1990s on a Youth International internship, if any of you remember those, I was supporting work on the Thai-Burma border and in the conflict in Nagaland, which remains one of the real forgotten conflicts of our time. And one of the things that was really clear to me was these conflicts were about more than exclusion and the need for societies to feel included by the dominant group in their respective countries. These were about pluralism. It was about respect for different cultures, languages, traditions, and histories, and to respect those as the basis for a stronger society rather than something that needed to be violently suppressed, as they were in both the cases in Myanmar and in the northeast of India. But I think back to those times when I think more internationally, and I'm really reminded that we lived in a particularly tumultuous time, even then in the late 1990s, and sort of an important reminder as we're in the midst of the pandemic and what feels like possibly the most tumultuous time that any of us have lived through. I would listen to the BBC World Service late at night I was living with a refugee family in one of the camps near Mae Hong Son, and we would listen to stories of the US, NATO bombings of Yugoslavia and the escalation of the conflict there. Russian forces had overtaken Chechen forces in Dagestan. India and Pakistan were standing off against Kashmir. And so the world was sort of falling apart around us in a way, but I also remember that we felt optimistic at the same time. The Good Friday Agreement had been signed, and I think we all felt strongly that peace was, within the grasp of the people of Northern Ireland. The East Timorese had held their referendum for independence, and that felt like a new chapter. The Ottawa Convention to ban landmines had happened. We felt like progress was moving forward, and I think that may be something that we don't necessarily sense today. And so what has changed now, and what does that really tell us about where we need to go? And when I think about the pandemic of the last now year and a half, really, and the upheavals over these last couple of years, I think it's important to remember that we found an international community that was massively divided and entrenched in long-term conflicts before the pandemic. We saw an international community that had retreated from a lot of its obligations and had really lost its direction in terms of its ability to not just manage conflict or crisis manage, which even that we haven't seen much leadership on in the last year and a half, but also really a step away from any real moves for sustainable resolution and deeper resolution of the conflicts that plague us around the world. We see conflicts that are more complex, they're more fragmented, they're more deeply societally rooted. We've seen a blurring of lines. You don't see respect for humanitarian space in the same way. And these conflicts are more often recurring, long-standing, and of course resistant to resolution. The international tools to address these conflicts are falling really tragically short. When I think about my younger self listening to the BBC World Service back in the day, you know, all of these same questions still come to the fore. The question of Kashmir looms large. Even following 25 years on from Dayton, the Balkans struggles with trauma, with nationalism, with unresolved issues from that conflict and deeply entrenched divisions that have actually in some ways arisen out of the peace process itself, entrenching divisions in the Balkans rather than trying to resolve them. And of course, Myanmar, as we all know, is reverting back to the tragedy that it was, and perhaps even worse. And I say all of this because I think it's really important for us to be really realistic about where we are when we talk about transformative and new approaches, which is really what we seek to do with pluralism. That we don't want to be naive to the enormous challenges that are ahead of us, but I think it's also a reminder that we do need to shift approaches. We need to recognize that the approaches that have been used over the last decades have not succeeded in building durable peace, and it is really time to try new and different things. And so within that, I really feel like there is a greater need now than ever for really truly inclusive approaches, but it's also likely harder to get there. So we have these sort of the need, but also this serious challenge. And all of this, of course, brings me to pluralism. We've been speaking for 20 years about the need for inclusion in peace processes, and generally that has focused on the number of women that have sat at the table or as signatories to agreements, coming up with different clever formulas for inclusion, side dialogues, women's steering or advisory groups, additional delegations of civil society to come for a day or two to formal talks. And while several of those, have been really important to push the field in one direction, what I have seen more often than not is that they are surface solutions. They're not focusing on the underlying approaches that we're taking to peacemaking. And without really understanding what it is that we're trying to resolve, these solutions are never really going to have the results that we seek. And so within that, we really see pluralism as a transformative approach that takes us really beyond a notion of inclusion for a different way of doing business in peacemaking. So I wanted to start just by talking a bit about what we mean by pluralism. I know as Canadians, we all pretend that we know what it means, but a lot of us actually maybe mean different things when we think about it. And we, of course, at the Global Center spend all of our time thinking about framing pluralism. So to take a step back, diversity, which is another term you hear a lot, diversity in every society and at every level is a demographic fact. It's a universal demographic fact. Differences may differ, but the fact that there are differences in all of our societies is truly universal. Pluralism refers to the actions that we take to positively respond to those differences, to that diversity in our society, and to see that diversity as a basis for building a stronger, more successful, more prosperous, and more peaceful society, and not something that needs to be managed or overcome. So we really see this as different from inclusion in peacemaking because it isn't focusing just on dragging some extra chairs to a table, but rather it's really asking questions more fundamentally about how that table came into being. Do we understand why the table is there? Who has set it? Who set the agenda? Who has built the narratives around it? And what is the entire peacemaking system in which we are living and working, and the peace process system of any given process? How do we re-understand the entire process rather than just focusing on dragging some extra chairs up to a table? Another point, just to elaborate on pluralism, that I think is important for our discussion is the holistic nature of pluralism as a concept. We imagine it really having two kind of anchoring points. We all have laws and policies, constitutions, and so forth in society that govern, that are the institutional responses to difference in our society. Those would be laws about minority rights. It would be accession to UN international treaties and norms. It would be legalization, for example, in last decade's legalization of same-sex marriage, all of those sorts of pieces that that refer to the institutional responses to diversity. And we refer to those as the hardware of pluralism. But those aren't alone what makes up a pluralistic society. The social and cultural norms and responses in a society are necessary to underpin the laws and policies that govern our society. They influence one another. Once you have legal frameworks, it serves to change mindsets. But the mindsets, the historical narratives, the way we talk about difference in the media and so forth, all of these pieces inform how our legal frameworks operate, and we really think about that as the software of pluralism. And so for us, it's really important to imagine both the hardware and the software. And from a peacemaking perspective, understanding it's not enough to have a pretty peace agreement. You have to have the normative underpinnings. You have to put in place processes that help to develop the social norms. Sorry, I just heard somebody say something. Are you able to hear me? I'm giving a high sign.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I think something.
Okay. Great. Okay, thanks. So then finally, just to say that we see this concept of pluralism really as a conceptual frame and not as a singular model. So Canada's approach to pluralism doesn't look anything like Afghanistan's approach to pluralism, Colombia's approach to pluralism, or Kenya's approach. All of this is a frame through which each society would take forward their own contextual understanding of this. So if we think about this now from a peace process perspective, how do we approach this in peacemaking itself? So we have been thinking a lot about how you would develop essentially a pluralist peace process. And a pluralist peace process would transform both the process itself as well as the outcomes that you're seeking in the peace agreement with three really core objectives. The first is that all decisions would be viewed and taken through a pluralist lens with a commitment by the parties that embracing diversity is at the core of building more long-term sustainable peace in their own societies. The second is that the process would lay the basis for how engagement with the different actors in the society would be underpinned by a respect for difference rather than adversarial approaches. So the way the process would be managed, again, would start to adopt these sorts of principles of respect for difference. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, the substantive outcomes of the process would set the society on a path towards greater respect for diversity. So we look at the elements of this process in sort of six different pieces. We look at analysis, guiding principles, representation, consultation, outcomes, and implementation. And we see that all of these pieces collectively, if they're approached from a pluralist perspective, can have a really transformative impact on a peace process. So what would this sort of look like? The analytical frame of it would begin, first of all, by not presupposing that we know what difference matters in a given society. If I think about South Sudan as an example, there's been a lot of critique around the dichotomy between the Dinka and the Nuer as the main ethnic players in the conflict, and oversized approaches to some of those two sort of dichotomies. Now, if you look at the wider social context of South Sudan, you see multi-layered issues of difference that go, first of all, beyond ethnicity and the sort of the political underpinnings of that, but also are multi-ethnic, not simply binary in that approach. So we would ask questions about what differences matter how those differences matter, how they manifest themselves, what are the approaches that have currently been taken, and how do we understand that societal context from the wider pluralist perspective before we begin to build an agenda and come up with solutions related to the conflict. And so analysis sort of frames some of these other interconnected elements within a pluralist peace process. So then we move on to issues of representation and consultation, which is where a lot of inclusive approaches to peace processes have generally spent a lot of their time. The idea of the need for representation of women and youth at the table, wider consultations of women and youth. What a pluralist approach enables us to do is look beyond some of those elements, but also to unpack those elements as well. I think most likely women and youth would be identified as marginalized groups within a community. A pluralist approach would allow you to understand how you break down an understanding of women or youth within that society, which, as we all know, are simply not a monolith. And a rural Hazara woman in Afghanistan is experiencing this conflict considerably different than an elite urban Pashto woman in Kabul. We know that there are differences within these different spaces, and we need to understand those, and pluralism allows us to be much more intersectional about how we look at difference, and therefore how we frame these sorts of consultations and representation in a peace process. I think that the next piece, which is possibly the hardest to achieve, but something I think would be really important to push, is to apply pluralism as a core guiding principle by the parties and the mediators in a process. This would guide decisions around the process, as well as ensure that compromises that would be made during a process, during the negotiations, would be sought within a frame around how this is impacting respect for diversity and embracing of diversity in the overall wider process and wider society. It would almost set some guardrails so that you wouldn't necessarily have transactional agreements that would dramatically disadvantage other groups in order to enable an agreement between two dominant groups, for example. I think this is probably one of the hardest pieces of the puzzle to achieve, but obviously we still feel like it's worth trying. And then just to the final and kind of more core pieces of the process, which would be substance and implementation of the agreement. We would see a framing of each piece of an agreement in a peace process: power sharing and transitional arrangements, economic arrangements, security sector reform and ceasefires, transitional justice, all of these pieces through a pluralism lens. How would you build a transitional arrangement that would set in motion collaborative arrangements between different groups, ensuring that disadvantaged groups in the society are able to engage, and that this isn't a cake that's being cut between two larger, more dominant groups, more dominant political players, and so forth? How can you avoid some of the pitfalls we've seen in other places, like in the Balkans, where you sort of calcify identity around ethnic groups rather than trying to create more shared national narratives that both respect the different narratives of different ethnic experiences or other experiences in the society, but at the same time enables people to come together across those differences to build a society that includes and engages with all of them. So really trying to rethink how you would go about those agreements, and then thinking about then how you would not just implement them, but how you would benchmark against that, how you would measure those agreements in the future going forward, to really lay the foundation for putting the society on a path towards a genuinely inclusive approach that really takes the pluralist lens. So that's sort of how we're framing the ideas of a process. I would say that several people that we would speak to would say, but a mediator can only do so much, and you're always limited, and you might not have an all of society mandate in a given process, and so forth. And I think there's a lot of things to discuss about how you can actually build these principles in smaller processes, build some of these principles in even when you have limitations as a mediator, and so forth. And I'm really happy to speak to some of the cases that I've been involved in, where even before we were talking about it as a pluralist decision making or pluralist process design, we were actually doing some of it even before we actually called it pluralism, as it were. So finally, I just wanted to maybe just respond to one of the questions, Hamid, that I think you had mentioned in some of the preparatory work about sort of what do we all do with this, sort of how do we take this forward? And the first piece, from a sort of an advocacy perspective that we've really been focusing on at the center, is that we feel really strongly that governments need to recognize that the multilateral system for peacemaking as it is currently constituted simply isn't working, and that we do need governments like the government of Canada to be taking more of a leadership role on the multilateral stage, to be thinking more about how they could be stepping forward and promoting a more inclusive multilateral approach, and quite frankly, a pluralist foreign policy, and join with other like-minded governments to be moving this forward. This shouldn't just be the purview of academic civil society and the like. However, that's not to say that there isn't a huge role for all of the rest of us in this. And I think one of the first things is really just applying a pluralist lens when you're thinking about different conflicts that you're analyzing, that you're studying, or that you're working in directly, and testing out some of these tools, and thinking about how you're framing different issues and how these conflicts are being imagined. I would also say that there's probably a lot to be learned from how some of these issues have been discussed in processes in the past, even when they haven't been termed pluralism. And so again, particularly from an academic and research perspective, I think it's really, really interesting to delve back into some of these processes and see how some of these issues might have been
go get a drink
during that period, and what can we understand from what worked, maybe what didn't, and some of the maybe hidden successes that we have in the past. And I think that would be something really exciting for students and academics to be delving into a little bit more. As I mentioned, I'm really happy to speak a bit more specifically on some of the processes I've been involved in, but maybe I'll stop there just to give us lots of time for discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the outstanding lecture you gave. It was really informative and interesting as I got. Let me move on the question and comment. I was checking the Facebook. Anyone's actually, if you have any comments and questions, you can actually use the chat box or Facebook comment. And even actually don't hesitate to raise your hand, and then you can talk. But I received two questions. First, let me ask, and then we can actually move, because I see some professor, even Professor Anusha Terjanian, she's here, so we can actually invite her as well. Okay, the first question, how can we use a value-based approach by promoting pluralism in and for peace process? It's one of the questions.
Sorry, can you say that again? You broke up just a little bit when you said that.
Yeah, how can we use, I think, as a peacemakers, a values-based approach by promoting pluralism in and for peace process?
So, the values-based approach element to this, I think, is really interesting. A lot of mediators would say that they are not there to promote values, and that this is sort of, they have to be guided by the parties to the conflict themselves. First of all, I take a bit of issue with that, because you do have a value. If you show up as a mediator, you believe that peace is better than war. And you therefore believe that these guys sitting down and having a conversation and coming to some sort of form of governance arrangement is better than them fighting it out on the battlefield. So I think at the beginning, we all just need to recognize that we are values driven to a certain extent. One of the pieces for me around pluralism is that I also think that it gives some tools to govern more easily, that doesn't have to be about the sort of hearts and flowers and everybody needs to get along and this is all wonderful. But this offers you a frame to manage your society in a way where the cake gets bigger, the economy gets bigger, you're able to do other things from a governance perspective, you're able to engage with others. And so sometimes I think that there's maybe a business case to be made around this that isn't just about this is for the greater good, as it were. And I think it's also important to really tap into what the specific contextual cultural values around diversity are, because when you really look in most societies, those values around the importance of diversity, symbiosis between different communities exists. It just needs to be kind of reimagined, recaptured in the narratives. And I think a lot about the Middle Belt of Nigeria as an example where, I mean, many of you will see it on the news, you know, there's the farmer-herder clashes of the Middle Belt of Nigeria seem to be the sort of the broad headline. When you delve into discussions, particularly with women in a lot of those areas, they say, you know, the relationship between herders and farmers for generations was really interestingly symbiotic. We needed the cows on our farmland because they were the fertilizer. They needed us because we were the grazing lands. And so there is a symbiosis, and there was connection, there was trade, there was an understanding, there were cultural understandings between them. A lot of that has been pulled apart by the conflict and by environmental degradation and a variety of other pressures. But a respect for the diversity and the need for these two different ways of living in order to support one another has pre-existed, and it's a matter of finding it again. And so I don't always necessarily see it as something where we're bringing in and importing a value, but we're helping people to reframe how they think about their own society when they've got into these boxes that are so narrow that they can no longer see the perspectives of others in their own society.
That's wonderful. Actually, I received a really long question from Anna Ohanian. Anna, if you can actually talk, you can unmute yourself and you can ask your question because it's really long for reading. Can you talk?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, go for your question.
Sure, thank you so very much for such an enlightening presentation. I very much look forward to learning more about the pluralist framework. I kind of have been thinking about the war and the peace processes. I'm not even sure we could call that in Ukraine, as well as Nagorno-Karabakh post-war in the South Caucasus. It's a very brutal war. What we have right now, essentially, in Nagorno-Karabakh, a peace process that was barely holding the peace, but it was doing it, was bulldozed through and completely obliterated. Now, any stability that is there has illiberal powers in charge of the peace process. And that led me kind of started to think about, quote unquote, illiberal peace building. Yeah. I'm grappling with this. What are your thoughts about cases such as the Eastern Ukraine peace process, Nagorno-Karabakh, where these peace processes are captured for political reasons, narrow geopolitical reasons? Is it worth to continue to work through these processes as a peacemaker, considering that they can come at the expense of human rights issues on the ground? Yeah. Thank you in advance.
Thank you, Anna. I'm sort of smiling because every time I give a presentation, there's always somebody who comes up with the thorniest conflict you could possibly imagine and how might you resolve that, and it's always the tough question, which I love, which is great. And I mean, I think there's a lot of things that would need to change for these kinds of ideas to really take root at the highest international level. What I see, for example, in Ukraine, where I've spoken to some of my former colleagues with HD, who of course do a lot of local work there, is I think that there are things often to be done at the local level when things are really frozen at the higher levels. And so I think one of the things that's really important is that we don't give up when you've got those frozen spaces of the Turks and the Russians and whoever else running the table at the highest level. And I think that there's also space to start building some of these notions of pluralism in a micro sense with communities that see the interconnected nature as something that has direct benefit to them, not existential sort of national identity benefit, but benefit in terms of trade, benefit in terms of ensuring that hazardous environmental waste isn't seeping into their groundwater and poisoning their children. There are ways that you can see those sorts of collaborations in really practical ways that can start to build out for peace. So I do think some ground up approaches are important in that sense. I would say, however, that I know I would never oversimplify anything as enormous as those processes, but at the same time, I do think that part of the challenge we have when some of the less liberal states are running the table is I do feel like the peacemakers that would speak on these issues at the governmental multilateral level are in retreat. I don't feel like enough is being done by those governments who believe these things, who believe the wider the wider space of pluralism, of inclusion. What I've seen too often is a lot of governments will fund NGOs to do good things, but it's not as reflected as it should be in their own foreign policy. And so I do think that the onus is also really on a lot of these governments that say they want us at GCP and, you know, the International Civil Society Action Network and others to do good things. They also need to be standing up and pushing to reform the multilateral system as well.
Thank you. Actually, I see that Purab has raised his hands or her hands. If you can actually unmute yourself and introduce yourself and ask your question. Purab, do you hear me?
Yeah, I'm Purab. I'm from the Introduction to Conflict Resolution series. And I just had one question, is that how is the element of outcomes depends on pluralism? And how exactly, can you like give me a sort of example so that I can understand in a much better way?
Sure. So we would imagine, for example, that if you were thinking through transitional arrangements, transitional governance arrangements, one of the things that we've seen in a number of different countries in the Balkans, in Lebanon, with the confessional arrangements and so forth, is that transitional arrangements tend to become the law, the sort of the political law of the land. They tend to get calcified and codified. So what you see is, rather than it being a transitional moment where certain ethnic groups are enabled to represent wider constituencies in the interests of securing a ceasefire and getting peace, instead you see those same arrangements being in place 25 years on, and other groups are being shut out of engagement in governance arrangements and so forth. And so when we think about outcomes, we're really thinking about the fabric of the peace agreements themselves. I mean, to think about a case that I was involved in Kenya in 2007 and 2008, I was an advisor to Kofi Annan during the post-election violence and the mediation that followed. And one of the, the outset of that process, the political parties who were essentially the ones who precipitated the crisis, although the crisis had much deeper roots, wanted to have a political sort of quick power sharing agreement, and that was all they wanted the agreements to look at. What Annan and the panel of eminent African personalities did was they met with the parties, and then they said, okay, thank you very much. We're now going to go and talk to the people of Kenya and find out what's really going on. And they spent a great deal of time doing really, really wide, really broad-based consultations. And again, not assuming that they knew which differences mattered, going in and doing massive consultations, not just with women, youth, elders, religious leaders, other political parties, the business community, media, sort of anyone who wanted to come and sit in these massive town hall forums. And as a result of it, they were able to go back to the political leaders and sort of challenge their narrative of the conflict, to challenge their unwillingness to deal with any of the root causes of the conflict. And as a result, we came out with an agenda for the process that included the ongoing crisis and the violence, but also included, really importantly, a fourth item on the agenda, which was long-term issues and solutions, which included things like constitutional reform, which ended up leading to a huge constitutional reform and devolution process in Kenya. Truth, justice, and reconciliation, it was included in that basket, and several others. But a lot of that came, I would argue, from an understanding that they needed to have this more pluralist approach, first to understanding and analyzing the conflict, and then to how they would frame the agenda and frame the agreements that came out of the peace process.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
And just one more question.
Okay, go ahead, Purab.
Tell me the elements of the pluralism. Yeah, I'm just saying that. Can you mention the elements of the pluralism again? So one of them was analysis, outcomes, implementation, and the other three were?
So analysis, guiding principles, representation, consultation, outcomes, and implementation.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think we received a couple of them in chat room. One of our students, I think, asked you, could you bring an example of peace building that you have experienced by pluralism approach? if I'm right. Yeah. Can Meredith describe a specific experience? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think one example that we like to use is also thinking about how you would actually design a pluralist process from the outset. And again, in the Middle Belt of Nigeria, when I was with the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, we had been asked to look to see whether or not we could support resolution of conflict that had been going on in Plateau State. For any of you that know Nigeria, the levels of violence in a lot of these conflicts is extraordinarily high. And the conflict in Plateau, when we got involved, had been ongoing for almost a decade, and thousands of people had been killed. There was a state of emergency, essentially sort of military rule, curfews, a number of military checkpoints, and fairly endemic violence. When we went in, we said to the different communities, we said, we want to take a formal mediation approach, but at the same time, we want to understand what it is that you're seeking. And what came out really clearly was that people wanted to figure out a way to live together, that they mistrusted one another, they were traumatized, they were angry, but they wanted to figure out a way that there could be some kind of coexistence. And so rather than coming together with a sort of ceasefire or power sharing approach, the way that our process was designed to identify mechanisms for diverse coexistence within the community and breaking that down on a number of different levels. And so that would include things like access to normalization of different groups. And so they wanted to understand how they could locally negotiate that in a more equitable way. There are some larger citizenship laws in Nigeria that advantage and disadvantage different minorities in different states. And they wanted to figure out ways that, while they weren't going to change the Constitution of Nigeria, they could locally work around that so that all of the different groups in the society would have equitable access to education, and so the community, and how markets could coexist together, and so a roadmap for this common respectful coexistence. And so,
to the democratic process and power sharing, such as Myanmar or even possibly Afghanistan. How do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think I think it's Myanmar is a particular challenge at the moment, I think, with the military junta and lack of interest in really engaging at all, although I have other thoughts on how you would engage in Myanmar. What I would say on Afghanistan, for example, is that even without having necessarily the same frame of reference for a democratic system, if you were going to have discussions with the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban about a pluralist approach, is to begin by agreeing some frames around how you support and promote diversity within the country, how you ensure economically that economic benefits are getting out to the entire country, how you build a reconciliation process that looks at the diversity of experiences that people have had throughout the conflict and tries to ensure that everyone feels like their own unique experiences during that conflict have been respected and have been connected together, so that people are able to work together across lines, of course, in the future. In Myanmar, I think that the military junta would most certainly be a difficult one to convince on any of this, but it's, obviously you're not convincing them on anything related to any kind of governance at all, or nonviolence at this point. But I do think that there's a pluralist moment in Myanmar because you have the CRPH, the NLD, and other actors now in exile who are recognizing that a Myanmar that's predicated on an exclusionary idea is not sustainable. And they need to speak to the Rohingya leadership, and they need to engage with ethnic leadership, not just the armed groups, but the other ethnic leaders. And they need to have a genuinely inclusive process. And maybe that process right now doesn't include the junta. It includes all of the other democratic forces in Myanmar, so that when there is space to move past this horrible, horrible moment that Myanmar finds itself in, that the democratic forces on the other side are genuinely inclusive, that they're genuinely pluralist, because we all know that they weren't actually before. Under the NLD, that there was not this inclusive, pluralist vision of Myanmar. And so maybe the opportunity right now is not to even try to advance anything with the junta on that, but really try to advance with these other forces over time. I personally don't believe that the junta can sustain in the face of a really united population if the population can come together like that.
Thank you for your great conclusion and remarks. We are all sure with your action and your team's effort, we will be seeing improvement of pluralism in peace process. At the end, I would like to thank you for taking the time out, not just encourage us and teach us, but also to remind us there is something we can do as a student, researcher, and professor in other aspects in conflict studies and peace building. Thank you so much. At the end, I sincerely hope all of you enjoyed today. Thank you for your participation. Just keep these dates on your calendar. First annual pluralism lecture on May 19 at 12 p.m. and our next webinar about Central Asia and Caucasus on May 21st at 11 morning. Don't forget to follow the Global Center for Pluralism and Academic Club for Peace and Conflict Studies social medias for getting more updated. Thank you for attending. Have a lovely evening.